There's something almost universal about that feeling of being wronged. Or, on the flip side, knowing you've hurt someone, it just seems like a core part of being human.
Oh, absolutely. And figuring out what comes next, how you navigate that, well, that lands us right into this really big and honestly pretty complicated idea, forgiveness.
It really is complex, isn't it? We hear the word all the time in our own lives. You see it in global events, stories. But what are we actually talking about? What is it? How does it, you know, work? Maybe even inside us.
Right. And that's exactly what we want to explore in this deep dive. We've gathered perspectives from, well, all over the place, really.
Yeah, we've got the really detailed philosophical breakdown from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
And then there's this fascinating neuroscience study using fMRI scans actually looking at brain activity during forgiveness.
Plus, some really raw, honest thoughts from people sharing their own experiences on an online forum. It gives that personal dimension.
So the goal here is to kind of weave these together. We want to unpack what forgiveness actually is, make sure we know what it isn't. Those distinctions are important.
Uh-huh. And look at how different fields think about it, what the science tells us, and then, hopefully, connect it all back to how we might experience it ourselves.
Basically, yeah. Think of it as a way to get up to speed on this surprisingly layered topic without having to read all the dense source material yourself.
Okay, so let's jump in, starting with that foundational question from philosophy. What exactly is forgiveness?
The philosophical analysis we looked at is very precise here. It defines forgiveness as a particular kind of response you have towards someone who's treated you, or maybe someone you care about, badly or wrongly.
Right, and it mentions it's usually a dyadic relation, which is just a technical way of saying it typically involves two key parties, right?
Exactly. The wrongdoer and the person who is wronged. And while the details can shift depending on the theory, you see common elements pop up again and again. Things like letting go of those really negative feelings, resentment is the classic example.
That burning feeling.
Yeah. Or it could mean choosing not to act negatively, maybe deciding against revenge, or even just avoiding the person.
Mhm.
And sometimes, though not always part of the definition, it might involve trying to repair the relationship.
So just framing it like that brings up some big questions straight away.
Mhm.
Like, what are you actually doing when you forgive? Is it just a feeling inside or something more?
That's a central puzzle for philosophers, yes.
Hmm.
Another one is who gets to forgive? Do you have the right, the standing, as they call it? Can you only forgive harms done directly to you?
Hmm.
And then there's the whole moral dimension. When is forgiving the right thing to do? Is it always good? Or are there times when maybe it's not appropriate? We'll definitely touch on those aspects.
But before we dive deeper into what forgiveness is, that philosophical source really stressed something important, knowing what it isn't. It gets mixed up with other ideas all the time.
Yeah, and getting these distinctions clear really helps define what makes forgiveness unique. So first off, it's not the same as justification.
Meaning, if what they did wasn't actually wrong.
Precisely. If an action is justified, there's no moral wrong to forgive. The example they give is like taking a pear from a fruit stand, but then you say, oh, I own this stand. You've justified it. It wasn't wrong.
Got it. So forgiveness is only on the table when something genuinely wrong happened.
Exactly. Then second, it's different from excusing someone. An act can still be wrong, but maybe the person isn't fully blameworthy because of certain circumstances.
Like maybe they were under extreme pressure or made an honest mistake that wasn't entirely their fault.
Right. Using the pear example again, taking it from your neighbor's stand is clearly wrong. But perhaps there was some very specific, unusual situation that lessens your personal responsibility for doing it. That might be an excuse. But the key point here is that forgiveness, according to the philosophical analysis, doesn't wipe away the wrongness of the act. It's a response directed at the person who did the wrong, acknowledging they did something blameworthy. Even if you also acknowledge mitigating factors, your response to them changes.
Ah, okay. So you still see the act as wrong, but your stance towards the person shifts.
Yes. And the third one, which can be particularly tricky, is the difference between forgiveness and condonation. Condoning is more like putting up with something or accepting it without really challenging it.
The source mentioned two types, didn't it? Something like acondonation and decondonation.
Yeah, a condonation is where you kind of stop judging the action as wrong altogether. You basically accept it. Decondonation is more like you still think it's wrong, but you tolerate it, you put up with it.
So how is that different from forgiving?
The crucial difference highlighted in the analysis is that forgiveness requires you to still see the person as having done something wrong. You maintain that judgment about the act. If you condone it, especially in that base sense, you've kind of let go of the judgment that it was wrong, so there's nothing left to forgive in that specific sense.
Right, you've effectively erased the wrongness from your perspective.
Exactly. And a couple of other subtle points they make. You can condone things that weren't wrongs against you personally, whereas forgiveness is usually about wrongs that impacted you.
Okay.
And typically you condone the conduct, like saying, I condone lying, which sounds a bit odd, actually. But you forgive the person for their conduct. I forgive you for lying. That makes perfect sense. The source calls the first one infelicitous.
That's really helpful for mapping out the specific territory forgiveness occupies. Okay, so we know what it isn't. Now, back to that question of who gets to do the forgiving. Who has the standing?
The philosophical source lays out a few main types of standing. The clearest one is direct standing. That belongs to the person who was directly harmed by the wrongful act.
Simple enough. If Alfred lies to Betty, Betty's the one directly wronged. So she has direct standing to forgive Alfred.
Exactly. But then it gets more complex. What about people affected indirectly?
Ah, the ripple effects.
Right. That brings us to indirect standing. This is for someone who was harmed as a result of the wrong done to the direct victim.
So in the Alfred and Betty case.
If Alfred lying to Betty made Betty late to pick up Todd, Todd wasn't lied to directly, but he was still harmed by the consequences of the lie. The source suggests it's plausible Todd also has standing to forgive Alfred, specifically for the inconvenience or harm caused to him.
Okay, so direct victims and potentially indirect victims. Is there anything else?
Well, there's the idea of proxy standing, which is quite controversial. This is when someone tries to forgive on behalf of someone else who had direct or indirect standing but can't forgive for themselves.
Maybe because they're incapacitated or even deceased?
Exactly. The example given is Ted forgiving his daughter Maria's assailant because Maria can't communicate. Whether this kind of forgiveness is really meaningful or even possible is a big philosophical debate.
Wow, okay. So forgiveness is this specific response to wrongdoing, different from justifying, excusing, or condoning, and there are complex questions about who even gets to grant it. But what is the nature of this response? What are philosophers saying forgiveness actually is?
Yeah, there are several main schools of thought outlined in the analysis. A very influential view is what they call emotion accounts. These see forgiveness as fundamentally about a change in your feelings toward the wrongdoer.
Like that quote mentioned in the source, forgiveness is primarily a matter of how I feel about you. It's about overcoming negative emotions.
That's the core idea, yes. Resentment is often seen as the main negative emotion to overcome. It's kind of the received orthodoxy, as the source puts it. But, there's discussion about whether other emotions like anger, hatred, contempt, or even sadness might be involved too.
And it's not just like forgetting about it or hitting your head and suddenly feeling different.
No, crucially, these accounts emphasize the change in emotion needs to happen for reasons. Often these are seen as moral reasons. Perhaps the wrongdoer has shown genuine remorse, they've repented, or maybe they've suffered enough consequences. It's a reasoned emotional shift.
Okay, so that's the emotion-focused view. What else is there?
Well, there are punishment forbearance accounts. These connect forgiving more closely to pardoning or making a conscious decision not to punish or seek revenge.
So it's less about internal feelings and more about external actions,
Yes.
or the lack thereof, like choosing not to retaliate.
Right. It's about forbearing negative treatment. Then you have assessment accounts. These argue forgiveness goes beyond just feelings or actions. It involves changing how you fundamentally see or assess the wrongdoer as a person.
This sounds like Jean Hampton's view, which the source discussed.
Exactly. For her, forgiveness involves overcoming negative emotions, plus an intentional change in your assessment of the person's character. Maybe you come to see them again as a decent person, someone worthy of associating with, despite their wrongful act.
But you still think the act itself was wrong.
Absolutely.
Wow.
That's key. You disapprove of the action, but you have a change of heart towards the person. This clearly separates it from condoning, where you might stop judging the act.
That's a powerful distinction, judging the sin, not the sinner, in a way.
Sort of, yeah. Then there's another perspective, performative accounts. These focus on forgiveness as a social act, often a linguistic one, like the act of actually saying, I forgive you.
Like speech act theory, what you do with words.
Precisely. Drawing on J.L. Austin, these views look at what happens when you utter those words. Saying, I forgive you could be a habit of expressing your internal state, like you've overcome resentment.
Wow.
Or it could be a commissive, committing yourself to future behavior, like promising not to bring it up again or to treat them with benevolence. Or, some argue, it could even be a declarative an act that actually changes the social reality, like officially releasing the wrongdoer from certain obligations or relinquishing your right to blame them publicly.
So the words themselves can change the relationship dynamics. Forgiveness isn't just internal.
Right. And one philosopher, Marilyn McCord Adams, offers a useful distinction here between two modalities. Performative forgiveness, the external, behavioral side, may be more formal, not necessarily requiring deep interchange. And forgiveness from the heart, the internal psychological process of shifting feelings and judgments.
So forgiveness can have both an inside and an outside dimension.
Exactly. It can be both internal shifts and external actions or declarations. It really highlights the complexity.
It's clear just from philosophy that there isn't one simple definition. Different angles emphasize feelings, actions, judgments, social acts.
And interestingly, that complexity carries over into psychology. The source explicitly states there's no consensual definition of forgiveness in the psychological literature either. They also approach it from various angles.
They mentioned interpersonal models.
Yes, those tend to view forgiveness as something happening between people, often involving communication and aimed at reconciliation. Some even propose it's like an evolved strategy for restoring cooperation after someone defects or breaks trust.
Okay, so focusing on the relationship aspect and the opposite.
Intrapersonal models.
Right.
These focus on what happens inside the person forgiving within one's skin, as they say.
And how do they break that down?
Different models emphasize different internal mechanisms. There are decision-based models. Forgiveness is a conscious choice, an act of will to let go of negativity.
Just deciding to move on?
Sort of.
Mm.
Then motivational models focus on the shift in desire, less desire for revenge or avoidance, more desire for the person's well-being or at least neutrality.
Okay.
Cognitive models highlight changes in thinking, reframing the event, changing your beliefs about the offender or the situation. And emotion-based models, much like the philosophical ones, center on replacing negative emotions like anger with positive ones, often empathy.
So psychology mirrors philosophy in seeing potential shifts in decisions, motivations, thoughts, feelings.
Pretty much. And they also have mixed models that try to bridge the internal and external, like distinguishing between silent forgiveness, feeling it inside but not saying it, hollow forgiveness, saying it but not really feeling it, and full forgiveness, both aligning.
That makes intuitive sense.
Yeah, or other models that say true forgiveness requires changes across the board: cognitive, affective, emotional, and behavioral.
So across disciplines, we see this picture of forgiveness as this really multifaceted thing. It involves complex internal changes, potentially external actions, and it's not easily pinned down.
Absolutely. And it gets even more fascinating when you start looking at what might be happening in the brain during all this. Which brings us to that fMRI study.
Right, moving from concepts to biology, they used fMRI brain scans to see what's going on when people actually engage in forgiving versus, say, holding on to a grudge.
The setup was quite clever. They had people imagine scenarios where someone had hurt them. Then they were specifically instructed to either try to forgive the person, and they were given strategies like trying to understand the offender's perspective or thinking about shared responsibility.
Okay, active reappraisal.
Exactly. Or, in the other condition, they were told to remain unforgiving, to really focus on the hurt, the resentment, maybe even thoughts of revenge.
And what was the big takeaway in terms of how people felt?
A really striking finding was that choosing to engage in forgiveness was strongly linked to reporting more positive emotions and, significantly, a feeling of subjective relief. The correlation they found was incredibly high, R of 0.94.
Wow, that's almost a perfect correlation. So the act of forgiving in this controlled setting really seemed to make people feel better, feel relieved.
It strongly suggests that, yeah, it points to forgiveness being tied to a tangible sense of release.
So what did the brain scans show? Which parts were lighting up?
When they compared brain activity during forgiveness versus unforgiveness, some key areas stood out. One was the DLPFC, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. This area showed more activity during forgiveness.
And that part of the brain is involved in?
It's heavily involved in cognitive regulation of emotion and reappraisal. Basically, the brain's machinery for deliberately thinking about things differently to manage your emotional response.
Okay, so that fits perfectly with the instruction to use reappraisal strategies. The part of the brain that does that work was more active when people were forgiving.
Exactly. It supports the idea that this kind of cognitive effort, changing how you evaluate the situation or the person, is a key component of the forgiveness forgiveness process neurologically.
Interesting. What else?
Another area, the precuneus, was actually active during both forgiveness and unforgiveness.
Oh, why would that be?
Well, the precuneus is strongly linked to perspective taking and theory of mind, our ability to mentalize, to understand or infer what someone else is thinking or feeling, their intentions, their motivations.
Ah, so whether you decide to forgive them or stay angry, you're probably thinking about why they did it, trying to get inside their head.
That seems to be the logic, yes. You need to consider their mental state either way to figure out your response. But then there was an area that showed activity specifically during forgiveness. The IPL, the inferior parietal lobule.
And what's the IPL associated with?
It's been linked to attributing emotions to others and, importantly, having an empathetic attitude. Not just understanding their perspective, but perhaps feeling for them, connecting with their emotional state, maybe their suffering or distress.
Okay, so empathy seems to be a distinguishing feature in the brain activity associated with forgiveness in this study, compared to just holding on to resentment.
That's what it points towards. And the researchers didn't just look at isolated areas, they looked at how they might work together. They proposed that forgiveness involves a causally connected network involving these three regions: the DLPFC, precuneus, and IPL.
A network, so they're communicating.
It looks that way. The model suggested is something like this. Being able to take the offender's perspective, precuneus activity, and empathize with them, IPL activity, helps enable or facilitate the cognitive reappraisal work being done by the DLPFC, which is needed to actually shift towards forgiveness.
So understanding and empathy fuel the ability to rethink the situation.
That seems to be the idea. And critically, they found a link between this network activity and that feeling of relief we talked about.
How so?
Specifically, the strength of the functional connection between the precuneus, perspective taking, and the IPL empathy during the act of forgiving was significantly correlated with how much subjective relief people reported feeling, RDO.67.
So the better those two parts of the network were talking to each other, the more relief people felt.
That's the implication. It suggests that this specific interplay between understanding someone's viewpoint and feeling empathy towards them might be really central to why forgiveness can feel like a burden lifting.
Wow. Okay, so acknowledging the limitations, like maybe a small sample size,
Sure, it's preliminary.
it still provides this really compelling glimpse into the biological underpinnings. Forgiveness isn't just this abstract moral or psychological idea. It seems to engage specific brain systems involved in rethinking, perspective-taking, and empathy, and activating these systems is linked to feeling better.
It really does add another fascinating dimension, suggesting forgiveness might be a kind of neurobiological mechanism for resolving negative emotional states and boosting well-being.
Speaking of navigating those negative states and finding well-being, let's shift gears slightly, away from the brain scans and towards, well, lived experience. We looked at that online discussion, and there was one quote that just really struck me. Someone shared this. Forgiveness means giving up all hope of a better past.
Ooh, yeah, that hits hard, doesn't it? It captures so much of the struggle, and that online thread really brought that struggle to life. People talking about past hurts, things done to them, but also things they'd done, mistakes they couldn't seem to let go of.
Yeah, you saw stories of things from childhood feeling inadequate, feeling like a burden, still causing real pain decades later, messing with current relationships, making people feel just stuck. Even people who had tried therapy were saying they still felt exhausted by it.
And interestingly, that thread also introduced this coping strategy idea related to being stuck in the past. Someone suggested trying to change the past, not literally, of course, but by deliberately imagining how things should have gone, picturing the perfect version.
Like, it wasn't about delusion, about believing this fantasy past was real. It was presented more as like a mental exercise.
Exactly, a conscious effort to imagine a past that could have been. And the proposed reason for doing this was quite interesting.
Which was?
The idea was that this exercise helps you actually understand how you could have behaved differently or how the situation could have played out better. The argument being, if you can't even imagine doing better, maybe you haven't fully learned the lesson from the experience.
Ah, so it's less about changing history and more about unlocking possibilities for the future by mentally rehearsing a better way.
That seems to be the logic. It connects to that feeling of regret, often stemming from feeling like there's unfinished business or not knowing how things could have been different. Imagining the better way, even fictionally, was proposed as a tool to help quiet that regret.
That really resonates with the brain study finding, doesn't it? The link between forgiveness, which often involves reframing the past, and relief, Maybe letting go of the stinging pain, as the thread put it, and focusing on lessons learned is part of that relief mechanism.
It seems like a common thread, yeah. Moving from dwelling on the hurt to extracting some kind of learning or growth.
And that discussion also touched on something else mentioned in the philosophical source, self-forgiveness.
Right. Which is distinct from forgiving someone else. This is about dealing with your own past wrongs, your own failures or mistakes.
The philosophy source mentioned debates about whether concepts like self-resentment even make sense, but the personal stories really highlighted how real that struggle is for people needing to let go of their own past actions to move forward.
Absolutely. It's about applying some of these same principles, understanding, maybe empathy for your past self, reframing to your own actions.
So when we pull all these different threads together,
Mhm.
the philosophy, the psychology, the neuroscience, the personal stories, what emerges is this picture of forgiveness as incredibly multifaceted.
Definitely. Philosophically, we see it's a specific active response to wrongdoing, distinct from excusing or condoning. It raises deep questions about its nature, who has standing, the morality around it. And different theories focus on different parts: feelings, actions, judgments, social acts.
And then psychology comes in with its models, looking at it either between people or inside a person, focusing on shifts in decisions, motivations, thoughts, emotions. No single definition, but a shared sense that it's about resolving the negative impact of harm.
Then the neuroscience gives us this preliminary but fascinating window into the brain, suggesting a network involving reappraisal, perspective taking, and empathy seems to be involved. And engaging this network is linked to that feeling of relief, hinting at a biological basis for its connection to well being.
And finally, the personal reflections ground it all. They show us how deeply forgiveness or the struggle with it connects to how we process past hurts, whether from others or ourselves. It's about that difficult journey of letting go of regret, finding ways to learn, and ultimately moving forward.
It really is this complex tapestry. It can involve changing how you feel, how you think about someone, including yourself, how you behave, maybe even how you relate to your own past. And across these different views, there's this consistent theme linking it to mechanisms, psychological, perhaps neurological, that help us move beyond states like resentment and find some measure of peace or relief.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from defining forgiveness and marking it off from similar ideas through the different ways philosophers and psychologists conceptualize it, into the brain science, and finally connecting it to those deeply personal struggles with the past.
Yeah, the key takeaways seem to be that forgiveness is this active, distinct response. It's understood in many ways, involving internal and sometimes external shifts. It appears linked to specific brain functions like perspective taking and empathy, and it often serves as a pathway towards emotional relief and letting go of past pain.
So here's a thought to maybe leave you with, drawing from all this. If neuroscience suggests that taking another's perspective and feeling empathy are key brain activities in forgiveness, and the personal account suggests that even imagining a different past can help us release regret, maybe forgiveness isn't fundamentally about letting the other person off the hook. Perhaps its deepest function is actually about reshaping our own internal relationship with what happened, a process that allows our own minds, maybe even our brains, to find a pathway towards relief, towards understanding, and towards learning how to navigate our lives differently going forward.